Nuala O'Connor and Tania Hershman are quite a dynamic duo for a literary reading. Their stories are energetic and voicey and defy being boxed in by strict definitions of short story forms. Single-page flash pieces, which could be read sometimes as prose poems, sit gregariously alongside longer pieces, giving the readers plenty of variety. Both women have a gift for poetic prose, perfectly worded and buoyant with gorgeous imagery. In Nuala O'Connor's most recent Joyride to Jupiter, we're treated to an exploration of love and all its derivations? I don't think that's the word, but you know where I'm going with it. In all its manifestations, from long-term relationships which easily navigate nuisance infidelities to pain and faith and hopelessness that goes with fertility struggles. Tania Hershman's science-inspired stories are moving into a space of spiritual exploration, and her recent Some of Us Glow More Than Others entails that somehow managed to beautifully bring nuns and test tubes together without a drop of cynicism in the mix. There's a real joy to be found in the work of both of these writers, where the presence of kindness and optimism does not in the slightest detract from the depth of their themes of love, life, grief, and compassion, and we're delighted to have them both back at our festival. First up is Tania Hershman, Nuala O'Connor. First up is Nuala O'Connor. Nuala was born in Dublin, and she lives now in East Galway. Her fifth short story collection, Joyride to Jupiter, was published by New Island in 2017. Penguin USA, Penguin Canada, and Sandstone UK has published Nuala's third novel, Miss Emily, about the poet Emily Dickinson and her Irish maid. Miss Emily was shortlisted for the Gáis Energy Eason Book Club Novel of the year 2015 and longlisted for the 2017 International DUBLIN Literary Award. Nuala's fourth novel, Becoming Belle, will be published in 2018. And just a little bit about her from the critics. Hubert O'Hearn of London Economic has said that Nuala O'Connor is an absolute supreme designer of excellent stories. Following her is Tania Hershman, who is a former science journalist living and working in the UK. Her first short story collection, The White Road and Other Stories, was commended by the judges of the 2009 Orange Award for New Writers. She's also the author of poetry collection, the poetry collection Terms and Conditions. My Mother Was an Upright Piano, fiction section. Nothing Here is Wild, Everything is Open, poetry collection. And co-author of Writing Short Stories, a writer and artist companion. Tania is founder and curator of the fantastic ShortStops, the UK and Ireland Short Story Hub. Something from the critics. Amy Bender has said of her work and her stories that they are like colourful glass lozenges holding the substance of our everyday lives, sparkled up by unusual and wondrous. All right, please welcome Nuala O'Connor.
Hello everyone, and thanks a million for coming. Thank you, Jen, for that lovely introduction, and thanks to Pat and Jen for having me here again. I love this festival, it's my absolute favourite. I'm going to read a story from Joyride to Jupiter called Napoli Abu. Napoli meaning Naples, the story is set in Naples, and Abu is an Irish word, Gaelic for those of you who don't know what Irish is, and it sort of means, you know, whoop, like, so if I translated the title, it would be something like Go Napoli, Go Napoli. And the narrator's name is Tara. Fuck knows how I ended up agreeing to go to Naples with a spinster. Not even my spinster, but a stray of my sister's, offered up to me as a solution to my singlehood, a partner in the pathetic. Beatrice is on her own too, Clodagh said. She's into the kind of stuff you like, you know, art, old ruins, all that. She'd love to go to Italy. I'm grand going on my own, I said. Go on. Poor Beatrice is lonely. She could do with a break. So we sat side by side, two unbridled yokes, scrabbling for things to say, though the airplane hadn't yet reached 10,000 feet. Beatrice sneezed crazily as the plane climbed. Summer cold? I asked, though I couldn't care less. Allergies, she said. There's nothing I hate more than the allergy brigade, with their I can't eat this and I can't tolerate that, and does this have gluten? Snot-spewed hankies and garlands all around them. The only thing worse is a vegan. Jesus wept, I was surely headed into the longest week of my life. I fiddled with my iPod, thinking I could block her out with a consoling waft of Belle, but even I knew that would come off rude. So I tried some conversation. "Did you read about your man," I said, "who fried his wife's placenta and ate it?" Beatrice frowned, and I noticed again the colander shake of freckles across her cheeks, a waste on someone so plain. Or the fella who had liposuction and made soap from the fat. Lemon-scented soap, imagine. "I heard a chap on the radio," she said, "who cooked his own hip and ate it. He said it tasted of goat." "Ah, no," I said, "that's just mad, isn't it?" I grinned at her, settled back in my seat, and let the airplane's thrum wash through me. Beatrice mightn't be too bad after all. It might turn out grand. Beatrice didn't like Naples. It was too hot altogether, the people stared, the cobbles were too cobbly, the roadworks were overdone, and there was way too much graffiti for her liking. "Who, Tara," she said, "would deface a 13th century building? Just who?" She put her hand to the graffitied wall as if she might heal it. In Café Gambrinus, she sipped at a latte and wasn't seduced by the pastries, though I would have happily eaten two. I ate a toothbreaker of a biscotti instead, so she wouldn't think I was a pig, and cursed her with every bite. After an hour's worth of shopping, I suggested we leave the rush of Via Chiaia to walk the beach. She sloped glumly beside me. "I hate sand," she said. "Well, Beatrice," I wanted to say, "in that case, you can sit on a fucking towel on a bloody fucking bench." But there was something teachery, forceful about Beatrice, and I guessed I would neither swim nor sunbathe that day. Still, I tried. "I want to go to the beach," I said, meek as a newt in the face of her scowl. Beatrice just tutted, and we trotted on, down towards the water, where even she was mesmerised by the sudden curl of the bay. We stopped to look from one end of the promenade to the other. A squat fort sat to our left, oddly militaristic in the blur of boats and blue. The Bay of Naples. Lovely. "I wonder what that is," I said, indicating the fort. "It's the Egg Castle," she said, "Castel dell'Ovo." "The Egg Castle? The giant womb, isn't that it? It was probably stuffed full of Vestal virgins back in the day for the fellas to take their pick. Men, what?" "You mean prostitutes, I suppose," she said. "Vestals took a vow of chastity." I snorted. "Whatever. Do you think that kept the fellas off when men are all the same?" "No, Tara," she said, looking at me with those flat eyes. "They're not." We strolled the promenade, though I ached for the lap of seawater on my toes. Before long, we stopped at a restaurant for a pee, then we sat in the terrazza to have a drink. She had orangina, tea bloody total into the bargain, I thought. I started to tell her about Gabriel, and fair play to her, she listened to me banging on about how secretive he is, about the way he keeps everything to himself, like some old Fagin. I get fed up, I said, badgering for details about his life. So I go silent, but he doesn't seem to notice. The wine made me tongue-waggy. I googled his wife, you know. She's a top-notch solicitor, super successful, but square as all get out, ordinary, homey. How did she ever turn Gabriel on? It's a fucking mystery to me. The first rule of shagging married men, never Google the wife. Remember that, Beatrice, as you go about your business. I sipped my Falangina and glanced at her. The helmet hair, the minuscule lips, the dour set to her face. Poor shite. What man would even look at her? "My boyfriend is married too," she said. "You have a fella?" I sat up and leaned towards her. "Seriously, a married man? Well, get you, the Coppeline dove." "I'm no dark horse, Tara," she said. "You expect people to be a certain way, that's all, because of the way they look." She needled me with her cloudy eyes, and I wasn't sure if she was referring to my comments about Gabriel's wife or to herself. Whatever she meant, it shut me up. I drank my wine and looked out over the sea. The breakers were pearl-tipped and perfect, like waves in a film. The shoreline was spangled with semi-nude bodies, stock still on towels, soaking up the frazzle. Oh, to be flaked out beside them on a towel of my own. I looked back at Beatrice, who had remained silent. Go on, I said, tell me about him. Did you Google the wife? Beatrice blushed scarlet. I smacked the table. You did, you mad thing. I didn't need to, she said. I know his wife. Tut, tut, naughty, naughty, Beatrice, crapping on your own doorstep. That's worse than what I'm at. At least Gabriel is a work thing. No one knows anyone's other half in the office. Much better that way. How is it worse or better or anything, Tara? We can care about it or not care about it as we choose. I don't see that what I'm doing is good, bad, or indifferent compared to your situation. Ah, whatever, I said. So who is he? Who's she? Beatrice fidgeted with the hem of her t-shirt. She sighed and looked out over the bay. I followed her gaze to the blue of the sea, the dark seam of the horizon, then turned back to her. She was studying her handbag now, as if it might hold the key to the universe. She started to root around inside it. Was she ignoring me on purpose? I was having none of that after her revelation, and after all, I'd fessed up about Gabriel to her. Well, I said, who is this Romeo? Beatrice dropped her bag to the ground, tossed her head forward and pulled a bandana over her hair. She tied it at the nape of her neck. She wouldn't look at me. I'd rather not say, she said eventually. Do I know him? She glanced at me, uneasy but cocky. You do, she said. Who did we know in common? A few of the skins in Clodagh's group, not a looker amongst them. Then a thought clattered me in the face. It's not Phelim, is it? I said. I snorted at the idea of anyone having an affair with my tub-tastic brother-in-law, but Beatrice had turned 40 shades of puce. Jesus, tonight, listen, you're welcome to him. I thought of Clodagh suffering Phelim all these years, and here was the bugger having an affair, with Beatrice of all people, mousy, miserable, boring as shite Beatrice. I stared at her and she looked back, calm as you like. Fuck it, they could have each other. What was it to me? I tipped the rest of the wine down my neck. Will we walk up to the castle? I said. Sure, Beatrice replied. Castel dell'Ovo was long and flat-topped, punched with tiny windows. It sat in the sea on an island as if it had risen from the water and anchored itself there. Doesn't look like an egg, I said. It's not supposed to, she said. They say Virgil put a magical egg into the foundations to hold the place up. If the shell got broken, the castle would collapse and Naples along with it. Can you go in and look at the egg? I said. Beatrice reared her head back and gawped at me, and for the first time she laughed. And she didn't just laugh, she nearly puked up her orangina. She was gasping so much to catch her breath between guffaws. After each spasm, she waved her hand and thumped her craw. She'd look at me for a second and burst again into hoots. For fuck's sake, Tara, she said, between groans as her laughter died down. Oh, my Lord. What? I said. God, Tara, you're gassed. Did you not hear when I said the egg was magic? Bewitched. She giggled and set herself off into gales again. I like when people laugh. I'm a good-humoured kind of person. And even though I knew she was laughing at me, the mad sound of her was infectious. And I was soon chortling too. We stood on the prom, a pair of hiberno hyenas, barely able to stand for the gusts of laughter breaking through us. When we finally calmed ourselves, I linked Beatrice's arm, and we sauntered on towards the castle. Ah, it's all crazy, isn't it, Bea? I said. It is. Men, love, the whole shebang. You know, I keep getting spam in my email that says things like, marriage is boring, affairs are fun. It's like the universe knows what I'm at and wants to annoy me. But if it's not fun, why do you bother? Beatrice said. I never said it wasn't fun. But you said Gabriel's wife is a successful solicitor. You seem threatened by the fact. Is that fun? I turned to her. Are you feeling threatened now that I know you're trying to steal my sister's husband? Stealing? Beatrice laughed. What on earth would I do with him, Tara? I don't want to own Phelim. No, I suppose not, I said. Meanwhile, I've no clue why I picked Gabriel to love, the most reticent man on the planet. But there you go, I can't even do affairs right. And do you love this Gabriel? Ah, I suppose I do, until the next one comes along. She broke away from me and turned to descend some steps that led to the beach. I followed her. I took off my sandals. The sand was talc soft and hot under my soles. Beatrice kicked off her runners. We walked to the water's edge and let lacy waves wash over our feet. The first person we fall in love with shapes us, don't they? Beatrice said. Is Phelim the only man you've ever loved? I asked. She shrugged. The first one moulds our idea of love, I think. I bloody well hope not, I said. My first was a self-focused manipulator. A redhead turned me off Redzers for life. Beatrice pulled one foot through the water, watched its lazy arc. Do you ever think about family, she said. Kids. Brats. Gabriel says he'll give me a baby if I really want one. I'm hurtling towards 40, not sure I need all that now. I looked at her. The reflection of the Mediterranean made an angelic glimmer light her face. She smiled, one of those involuntary ones that slip up onto the lips because they can't be held down, a smile that's married to a secret. She looked luminous, standing there in the tide, a contented Madonna. A flash of childless Clodagh lit up my inner eye. Come here, Beatrice, I said. You're not pregnant, are you? No, she said, not at all. Her eyes were trained on the Castel del Ovo, and she stared at that place as if all she knew or cared about would burst up from under its foundations and lay itself on the shifting waves before her, like some sort of answer to everything. Or maybe she expected an egg to rise up, a magical egg that could burrow deep inside and alter a life. Thank you.
Goodness, I have to follow that. Thank you, Luna. It's so lovely to be back here again. I think maybe it's my 5th time at the festival, and really, Cork is where, in many ways, it all began for me, twice, in fact. I first read here in 2008, and it was the first ever public reading from my first book, which had come out the week before. And then, that was a short story collection. And then a year and a half ago, I launched my poetry chapbook here at the Poetry Festival when it won 2nd prize in the Fool for Poetry contest. And really, until that happened, I never thought I could be a poet. I never thought I could write poetry. So I wanted to say thank you to Pat and Jen for having me. And thank you for everything that you do for writers here and hundreds of us all over the world. It's a wonderful thing, and you made me a poet. Thank you. So, yes, round of applause. That's a segue into the fact that I'm here in this weird and miraculous and ridiculous position of having 2 new books out at the same time within 2 months of each other, a poetry collection and a short story collection. And in some ways it's really weird for me to have these 2 separate books because I really don't know where the short stories end and the poems begin. It's a continuum. And so I've made it a policy, and forgive me for taking liberties, of every time I do a reading a few from both books so that there's a kind of conversation between them. And there are 2 pieces that are in both books. So I see myself as a writer of short things. So I thought I'll read you a few very short things from the poetry collection and some slightly longer things from the short story collection. And also, a lot of the poems are stories. This one is called Baby. Baby travels trains, collecting faces. Baby may seem carried, but is, in fact, directing. Baby takes in all ages, colours, male, female, other. Baby understands the need for data. Baby's favourite is the oldest, its valleys, shades, and loose pinned edges. When baby is removed, there are thoughts of screaming. But instead, baby scrolls through images amassed One day, thinks baby, I will not be so smooth, so new. Let me be old, prays baby. Let me not be carried. Let me wait alone on dark platforms, knowing and not knowing where or why I'm going. So that one clearly is not autobiographical. One thing poetry has allowed me to do is somehow use autobiography in a way that I've never been able to do in my fiction, but we'll come on to that. I'll just do you 2 more short poems. I often also use science as inspiration, and there's some of that in both of these books. And this I thought was appropriate in terms of the news of the last few weeks and the horrific flooding and hurricanes in America. And this was inspired by a science article about fire ants. I don't know how many of you have heard about the fire ant, which is a species of ant in America, which is incredibly tenacious. And until the floods a few weeks ago, I'd never seen a picture of what it is that I write about them doing. And this is called What Do We Do When the Water Rises? Fire ants, when flooded, make of themselves a raft, hooking bodies. When stranded, make of themselves a bridge. And when a colony is tipped into a bucket, sphere. Scientists have tried to persuade them to disband, pushing the ant architectures further and further down into the water. But where a single ant will sink, together they cling on. How do they know how hard to hold and when to let each other go? And I'll finish with one that is entirely autobiographical. And it's kind of an example of when you can turn something which might seem like a negative experience into a poem. And this was inspired by something that happened to me on a trip to Mexico. This is called Advice for the Traveller. Fall, if possible, within the first hour of your arrival in any new city. Fall well, on knees and hands, in public. Make sure you are seen. Leading is optional. If someone immediately lifts you, without pausing his cell phone conversation, you will know that this is a place worth staying in. Limp to the nearest park, sit and watch locals by a fountain, dozing, kissing, walking dogs. Do not rush. If you have fallen properly, there will be no need to fall here again. Your knee's sweet sting and bruise will remind you of attention, the necessity for kindness. And he really did that. I fell right by the traffic lights on my first day in Mexico City, and this guy was talking on his cell phone, bent down, scooped me up, and then just carried on walking. That's so wonderful. That's so wonderful. Right, moving swiftly on to the short story collection, and carrying on with a little bit more advice, a very short piece, inspired by another article from New Scientist. If kissed by a dragonfish. If kissed by a dragonfish, do not bite. If kissed by a dragonfish, make sure you are sitting. If kissed by a dragonfish, let it sway you. Do not worry about a scale or two you may have to pick out from between your teeth. Do not worry during the kiss, before the kiss, or after. The dragonfish's skin is armoured, but its heart beats loud and soft. You will not forget the kiss. You will not forget the coolness of the dragonfish's breath inside your lungs. You will look down through the floor of glass and see nothing, swimming. You will part like an ocean, and on your seabed you will pearl. So this book, there are 40 stories or so in this book, a mixture of very, very short and longer stories. And a lot of them came out of the year I spent as writer-in-residence in a biochemistry lab, which was really fun. I have a background in maths and physics, but I'd never really worked as a scientist, so I wanted to go and observe scientists in their natural habitat. And it was fantastic, and I had a great, great time with all the strange sounds in the lab and all the strange smells and all the stuff and the liquid that they mixed. And the last 2 pieces I'm going to read for you, I wrote both of those for radio. And this one, just a page and a half, was the first piece I wrote inspired by the lab itself. And it's called Experimentation. 12:03 p.m. He sits at the microscope, counting bacteria. He hears her coming. She stands by his bench. She picks up a pipette. "I'd rather you didn't do that," he says. "Oh," she says, "okay." And she puts the pipette back and walks off. He writes in his notebook, 12:03, I say I'd rather you didn't do that. She says, "Oh, okay." He sets his timer for half an hour. 12:33 p.m. He sits at the microscope, counting bacteria. He hears her coming. She stands by his bench. She picks up a pipette. He looks up. He smiles at her. "Hi," he says. "Oh," she says, "sorry, I was just..." And she puts the pipette back and walks off. He writes in his notebook, 12:33, I say hi. She says, "Oh, sorry, I was just..." He sets his timer for half an hour. 1:03 p.m. He sits at the microscope, counting bacteria. He hears her coming. She stands by his bench. She picks up a pipette. He looks up. He holds out his hand. She slowly places the pipette in his palm as if it were a small animal. She grins. He nods. She walks off. He writes in his notebook, 1:03, I hold out my hand. She says nothing, hands over the pipette, grins. That's enough for today. He puts the plates of bacteria away and goes into the office, where he sits down at his laptop and records the new results. He decides that for the rest of the week he will make more variations. Tomorrow he will wear a lab coat. Thursday he will vary the time intervals by leaving the room shortly after each encounter. On Friday he will turn the lab radio to another station. He gets up to go for lunch. She is sitting at the other end of the office, her back to him, listening to something on her headphones. As he leaves the room, he remembers how it felt as she handed him back the pipette, her warm fingers touching his cold palm. So that's all the people in the lab thought that was about 2 people in the lab. Really, it wasn't at all. And this final story that I'm going to finish with, which is so long I have to turn the page once, this is entirely fictional and not at all based on any parties I went to. It's called The Party. We get to the party. We say hello to our hosts. We take off our coats. The party is crowded. We fight our way through to the kitchen. We load our plates with food. We sit in a corner. There are a lot of people. There are mathematicians and physicists, experimentalists and theoreticians. There is an elderly but still lively Nobel Prize winner. We are not mathematicians. We are not physicists. When someone asks what we do, we swallow our food and we say, biochemists. They are polite. They nod, but they change the subject. They talk about a film they have seen or about the decor of the kitchen. We nod, we talk politely too, even though we have not seen that film. At a certain point, there is music, quite loud, from the other room. We place our plates on the side and move into the hallway. We see people dancing, mathematicians, physicists, theoreticians and experimentalists, and the elderly but still lively Nobel Prize winner. We look at each other, and then we sneak up the stairs. We find the room where the coats are kept, and we sit on the bed. We hold hands. We hear someone coming up the stairs. We wonder about hiding, but it is too late. She comes into the room. Here they are, she calls to someone behind her. Come, she says to us, come. And she takes our hands, pulls us up from the bed. We look at each other. We do not understand, but she gives us no choice. Here they are, she cries as she leads us back down the stairs. I have them, she says, as she pushes us gently into the other room, where the music is loud, where everyone is dancing. Someone turns down the music, and everyone is looking at us, swaying and smiling. They open up a space, and there we are in the middle of the room, surrounded by everyone, smiling, swaying. We look at each other. We grip hands. We do not understand. The woman who has brought us down here, who took us from the coat room and brought us, says, will you please give us some of your words, your biochemistry words. And the others, the mathematicians and the physicists, the experimentalists and the theoreticians, the elderly Nobel Prize winner, they are all nodding, saying, yes, yes, give us your words, your words. We are shy. We are holding hands in the middle, the music still playing, everyone swaying. We look at each other, we wait. Is this real? We think, do they really want this? And then we do it. We begin, we say, DNA. DNA, they all say, DNA, DNA. Then we say, lymphocyte. Ooh, they say, and they repeat the word lymphocyte, they say, turning to one another, still swaying, lymphocyte. Organelle, we say then, and then lamellipodia. Lamellipodia, they cry, and someone raises up her arms. The woman who brought us here, took us from the coat room, claps her hands. Lamellipodia, she cries. We look at each other, we smile a little, we loosen our handhold. Then we say, green fluorescent protein. Oh my, says the elderly Nobel Prize winner. He does a twirl and then says green fluorescent protein. The words ripple around the room until everyone is whispering them, chanting them. Green fluorescent protein, green fluorescent protein. And the chant becomes louder and louder. Someone turns the music up and then everyone is dancing. We stand in the middle of the sea of dancing mathematicians and physicists, experimentalists and theoreticians, and the twirling elderly Nobel Prize winner, listening as they murmur green fluorescent protein as they sway and dip. We stand and we smile and smile. We feel wanted, we feel loved, we feel heard.
Well done, both of you. That was really fantastic. So a few questions. I'll start off with one, and hopefully we'll have lots of inquiring minds from the audience as well. So for both of you, I think something that strikes me about these collections in particular is I was struck by the optimism in there, and I wonder if you would agree that there's optimism in these collections, and do you think it's important to have, when in your own writing, an element of hopefulness in the stories? Yeah, I'll leave that there.
Yeah. A few years ago, so my last collection came out in 2012 in America, I had this idea after that to write a collection of funny stories, happy stories, because as someone who generally writes very melancholic work, I thought it would be a nice sort of break for myself in a sense. But that didn't really happen because I became very embedded in novel writing, and so I wasn't writing a lot of stories. But because I was writing historical fiction, often when I wrote a short story for a commission or for whatever reason, I would end up writing something very contemporary and sort of uplifting. So yeah, I think there probably is a lot of that present in the stories, and there's something joyful about writing things that are not necessarily, all bad and kind of, when you're writing a novel, something generally awful has to happen, some one-off event in the person's life, and the same in a short story as well, but it's a much different animal and you approach it so differently. So for me, writing short stories was kind of like a release. It was like a little shot in the arm type of event.
Great.
Right. It makes me really happy that you said that there's joy in our books, because I think a lot of these stories are really dark. But I realised a while ago that I think what I write are tragically optimistic stories. I think that's what I go for in the ending, that there's somehow a spark of hope even in the darkness, even if perhaps someone dies. So that I think is the sort of kinds of things I write. But the poetry, interestingly, there's even a poem in there called Happiness, and writing about happiness is really difficult, trying to capture that, but I like the idea that it's in there. And maybe it was the happiness of, the joy of doing the writing maybe came through in the content as well.
That might, I don't want to mischaracterize the stories at all, that they're super light or sort of, just, there are darknesses throughout it, but I was just struck by how it just, you didn't sink within the stories. There was something in there to propel you through, So, is anyone ready for a question? John.
So recently someone was asked me what was my favourite of my children. So this is sort of an unfair question like that. I can see an easy answer for you, but do you have a favourite answer between those two?
Did everyone hear that question?
What's your favourite
child
Short
story?
Story Festival? Which is your favourite? I meant, Tania, of your two books.
Oh! You want me to pick one of my books as my favourite child? No. They're right here, they can hear everything. I can't. I don't know. The poetry is much newer, and it's so unexpected that I'm writing poetry that there's an utter joy for me in the fact that this is my poetry collection, and it's really very recent that I've been able to say the words I am a poet. So there's enormous joy in that. I never thought it would happen. But these I wrote over many years and never thought that they would come to be in a book. So there's a lot of joy in that as well. I'm hedging my bets, I'm not picking, I'm sorry. But thank you for the question.
Yes.
I have a question for Tania and about the chemistry labs.
Oh no, are you a biochemist?
Last.
Oh good, last.
I was just curious about the topic of research in the lab that you work and how much you enjoy, watching the laboratory life. I asked because there's sort of a very pervasive dialogue between the model system, that scientists use, and the times of the day, but it also influences their language, the way they speak and what they do. And I wonder if you enjoyed watching that, help you create stories.
I did, I loved it. When I approached the head of the lab and said, can I be your writer in residence, he was very keen. He liked the whole art-science crossover, but a lot of the members of the lab were like, why do you want to watch us? What we do is really boring. And I said, you have no idea. It's just a different world entirely, and it felt like such a privilege to be privy to it. And I would go there once a week and I would sit and I would watch them. And it was very funny how I had no idea, you get the feeling for the rhythms of the lab, which are so different. It's a fascinating workplace that thousands and thousands of people all over the world work in, and yet all those of us who aren't scientists have no idea what this workplace is like. So I didn't know as well that in a biochemistry lab, every person is working on their own thing, their own set of experiments. At one point, there could be lots of people in the lab, and I was having a chat with quite a few of them, and then in mid-sentence, I would look up, and they all disappeared, because the priority for them was what they were doing with their experiment, and they were only half listening to me, and then they just all walked off when they needed to, so I was like, oh, okay. So I got, it was unnerving, and yet also it was really stimulating. And I try and encourage writers to steal from science. As you see, I just stole the words, and I can't tell you really what lamellipodia are. Maybe you can explain later. But there's such a rich vocabulary and all these tools, and the whole idea that everything is timed, and timers go off all the time. Somebody's always setting a timer, and there's lots of beeping, and it's just a fascinating world to spend time in. I just feel really lucky, and I hope that they like what I've done with entirely fictionalised versions of themselves.
Can I just ask Nuala, that after the work and the research that went into Miss Emily, is writing short stories for you a kind of a break from the work on novels? Is it something you do first? Is it your first love?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really passionate about the short story, but the more time I spend writing novels, the more sort of immersed I become in that world. I tend to research as I write, so I research a little about my subject to get my juices up, and then I do this thing where I research at night and write by day. And I've another novel coming out next year, which again is based on an actual person, and I just find the research very joyful, and I wonder, did I somehow miss a vocation as a historian or something like that, that I get such a buzz out of the research. And I try and keep good notes now, having learned about when you start going back to edit and your copy editor is asking you really probing questions and you run into difficulties because you can't remember where you found something out, or sometimes if you've made it up, you know. So yeah, the short stories, I tend to be really sort of precious about my writing time as well. And so when I'm writing a novel, I write it 5 days a week, from like whatever, 9 in the morning until about midday. That's my hours. And I don't want anything else to interrupt them. I become quite freakishly kind of controlling about that time. So sometimes you'll get a commission, so say if the Irish Times asked me to do a story for their summer series last year with this ridiculous short deadline. I know journalists work to short deadlines, but writers don't, and so I had to sort of put my novel aside to work on this story, and slightly resentfully, you know. But then I'm thrilled because I get back into the world of story, and it's like, oh, this is where I belong, you know. So I'm kind of wedded to whatever I'm working on at the time. But yeah, I do think my novels are kind of like linked to short story collections, which is a problem that my editors point out to me all the time. That my novels are very episodic, but that's exactly what I want. I would love to be able to pull chapters out and they could almost be stories.
There actually is a story in Joyride, which is Miss Emily-esque, the maid. I wish I could remember the title offhand. The Irish maid.
Is there an Irish maid in this one as well?
Longing for hope.
Oh yeah, yes. That was written, that was another kind of, I'm in an artist collective in Ballinasloe in County Galway where I live, and most of my fellow members are visual artists. So when we have an exhibition, I have to exhibit something. So what I usually do is write something like a flash on whatever theme we have chosen. And so that one, American Wake, was for one of our themes was, remember the year of the Gathering? We did an exhibition based around the Gathering, and so I wrote that. So often these stories are not arising naturally in a sense, they're because I have to write something. But I usually have tons of notebooks just full of little things, and a snippet is enough sometimes to send me off down a path. But yeah, I wrote that before Miss Emily, and I remember when I read it out, kind of talking about what I would like to do next, and it occurred to me there and then that I would like to do the novel about the Irish maid working in the Dickinson household. And when you say that in front of an audience of people, then there's an expectation you'll do it, so you kind of go and do it. Thanks, Des.
I'll ask another one. Something that I thought was really appealing about both of the collections is that you effortlessly bypass tropes about gender roles. I think we were talking at lunch about how sexual assault seems to be the only thing that can happen to women in big television nowadays. Like that's the one defining moment of the character, and then they get to work out what happens around there, and that's the only thing that ever happens to women. But there are infidelities in Nuala's collection where it's nearly more of a nuisance to the main character. She's like, oh, you know, that there are long-term relationships where it's something you work around rather than this defining tragedy of the woman's life in the collection. And in Tania's, we've got nuns that are also scientists, and they use it as a method to reach the spiritual precipice that, you know, it's not, I guess, not just gender tropes, but all sorts of. So my question about these things is, do you ever find yourself, when you're starting a story, drawn into something that's the stories that everyone's telling, the old stories that we tell ourselves about men and women or science, and then do you have to kind of rework it? Or is it just that when you're looking for something fresh and you're an experienced writer, you naturally circumnavigate that stuff and go for something new? Am I making any sense?
The way stories start for me is with a voice. But I collect, I don't really do much research for the short stories, but there are some things I do. I've been keeping a list for many years of interesting occupations. And there are some very interesting occupations out there. And a lot of the stories in this book came as inspiration from that list of interesting occupations. There's a story called The Special Advisor, and that was inspired by a real-life role as a special advisor to the UN on summary executions. And I heard this guy talk on the radio just after the assassination of Osama bin Laden. I thought, that's an interesting occupation. So a lot of the time the stories come out of, I take that list and then I collide often one of the occupations with something else maybe I've heard. This is the way that my brain, I've understood after nearly 20 years of how to get it to come up with the kinds of weird stories that I like to read and therefore that I like to write. So it's often a collision of things. Very little thought goes into it at all. Well, I mostly try and spend my time short-circuiting my logical brain, because I do have that. I'm not the only one. I can hear that. I do have that sort of the mind of a failed scientist, frankly. But I have to stop it thinking so that I can write the kind of weird stuff that doesn't involve a lot of thinking and let it really go loose. So generally it comes from colliding ideas and then a voice. And I just follow it to see where it goes, and if it takes me into nuns and biochemistry labs, or there's octopuses kept coming up. It's weird when you have all your stories in a collection and you see some of the preoccupations that you had over the years. But in terms of gender, I think because I started off as a journalist and then wanted to move into fiction, one of the easiest ways of fictionalizing a story is to write it from a point of view of someone who's definitely not you. And a man is definitely not me. So I often use a man's voice as my character. And I've never felt any inhibitions about writing from the point of view of a man, or sometimes from the point of view of an animal, or from furniture. I do have that as well. So one thing I've got to now, which in the short stories, is I have no inhibitions, and I sort of let myself go anywhere. And what's quite interesting is when I started writing poetry, whole new set of inhibitions, whole new inner critic in my head saying, you can't do that, that's not allowed, that can't be a poem. But I feel very free in the stories. But if something's boring me, I'm my first reader. Right. So if I hopefully stop before it starts boring me, or I just don't carry on, because I want to surprise myself when I'm writing. If that somehow answers your question.
Perfect.
Yeah, I suppose when you're a feminist, you come at things with a certain point of view, so you don't want to be reinforcing stuff.
Right.
You know, like we were talking today about Mad Men, and you know how just relentlessly sexist it is, and how I had to stop watching it after a while because I was just getting angry watching it. You know, it's so boring to me that every victim in every murder show is a woman who has been raped and, you know, whatever. And it's like, I don't want to write about that stuff to make a point to reinforce things that are already there. I'd rather write about, you know, the nun having an affair with the girl's dad,
Right.
that kind of thing. You know, that's more interesting to me. I remember one review of one of my early collections, and the reviewer said she didn't think it was credible that a happily married man would have an extramarital affair. And I was like, okay, what planet do you live on, dearie? You know, so I do write a lot about infidelity because I'm very interested in it. But as you said, it's not what...
It doesn't define the character.
Exactly, yeah. It's not necessarily the explosive moment or whatever. I'm much more interested in how women are in the world. I'm interested in social history. I'm interested in, you know, material culture, all that sort of thing. So I try and bring in just all the things I'm passionate about. I try and get them in there, you know.
When you follow your interests, the material will be fresh.
Yeah. And often something starts off as one thing. You think it's one thing. I'm like, Tania, I'm organic, I don't plan.
Yeah.
So it just becomes whatever it is as you go along, rather than you having a great plan.